Welcome to Box Recaps. Today I'm going to explain the movie Billionaire Boys Club, released in the year 2018. The movie begins and we see that a cassette with Billionaire Boys Club written on it is shown to Joe Hunt, and then it is placed in the cassette player. Then a voice starts to narrate. It tells that money means nothing, and it's about the way people see you. Being rich is about respect. Then we see Dean Carney, who belonged to a middle-class family. His parents did whatever they could to get him the best education, and they sent him to Harvard. There he met Joe Hunt, who was a scholarship kid with no friends. They both were unique, so they got together pretty well. Dean was not so well off, but he had the policy of fake it till you make it. Eventually, using his charms, by the time he was done with college, he signed a deal worth $250 million. Dean and Joe were living the life that only most people dream of. The next scene takes us 6 years after high school, where we see that by that time, Dean was not successful yet. Dean was trying to sell a car to a rich guy when he sees Joe, his old classmate, sitting there in a business meeting. They both meet afterward and tell each other what they've been up to. Joe is a stockbroker, and Dean is not really sure about what he does. As they're both not doing very well, Dean offers Joe that they could start working together. He then invites him to Charlie Bottom's birthday and tells him that he could be an investor for them. He agrees to go to the party. Later, as Joe gets to the club, he's troubled getting into the club, but Dean comes and takes him inside. The party was wild, and there was a group of girls there who dominated the room. They were known as the Groovers. They go and meet Charlie, along with 2 of his friends. These 3 were the richest kids in Beverly Hills. As Joe starts to pitch his idea to the boys, they get distracted and he feels embarrassed. They get back to him, and Joe sees a magazine. By reading that, he gets an idea. He starts to write down a philosophy. The next day, Dean comes to Joe's house, and Joe tells him about his idea. Dean immediately gives $10,000 to Joe to invest and turn the money double so that they can have investors lining up at their door. Joe takes the money and invests the money in gold. Their stocks are going 35% up, and there is no chance that they will lose the money. Dean takes Joe to meet Ron Levin, who was a millionaire, and Dean sold him a car a few weeks ago. Ron tricks Joe by showing him a fake artifact and making him believe that it was real. Afterward, they go to the Biltmore boys' house. Their parents are not around, and all their rich friends are there. Joe makes a spectacular pitch in front of everyone and impresses them, despite the fact that they just lost half of the money they invested in golds. They name their company BBC, which is something to do with a club in their school. That night, they go out with the rich kids. At dinner, Dean tries to further explain their strategy to the rich kids. At dinner, Ron sends them a bottle of wine, and Dean and Joe go over to thank him for the wine. There, Ron introduces them to his friend Andy, who works in the film industry. Dean tells Ron that they've made a 50% return on their investment, and Joe tells Ron to consider investing with them. Ron says that he was sure that they took a huge hit and did not make any profit. Joe sees Sydney Evans, who is sitting at the bar, and they both stare at each other. The rich kids are really excited about this opportunity, and they want to make big money with Joe and Dean. They find Joe and give him a check for $80,000 and tell him to make them richer. Afterward, Joe goes to Sydney, as she's about to leave, and asks for her help in art. He was basically trying to hit on her. Before leaving, Sydney tells him that she will think about it. From the cash the rich kids gave Joe, they bought a BMW M6, which was legal for the roads of America, but there were not very many of these cars in Los Angeles, so every rich person had a thing for these cars. Joe takes one of the cars to Ron and tells him his plan. They were making 500% profit on the cars. Joe asks Ron to invest in BBC. He tells him to at least throw in $10,000 to test the company. At this moment, Ron tells him that when I go in, I go all in. And he says that he had dinner worth $10,000 the other night. Ron then tells Joe that he invests in people, not in stocks, and it is going to take a lot more than just the cars for them to make Ron invest. Ron tells him that he reminded him of himself when he was young. Then he tells him how he got in the hot water with the SEC and was able to trick them. The rich kids were the first investors in the company, and they became the sales team for the company. They gained the trust of many rich people, including their own parents, and told them how much the company was capable of. BBC eventually had an office, and it was all starting to make sense. Many investors poured their money into the company, and even Ron was getting more and more interested in the company. BBC was all over Beverly Hills. Now Ron is also in the company as he fully trusts them. Ron makes a call to Frank, and Frank tells Joe that he has an account that is filled with more than $4 million, and Ron has instructed Joe to hand the account over to Joe. Ron hands them over the account, which contains more than $4 million, and they all must now work together to grow the account. Till now, the initials of the company, BBC, had no clear meaning. Ron, after making a huge speech in front of everyone, names it the Billionaire Boys Club. All the members of the company are very motivated thanks to Ron's speech. The money that Ron got them made them paper rich, but they were only supposed to trade with the money. They actually had no cash with them, so basically they were still broke. So they gather all the money that the investors could and put it into the business. Their investors start to take mortgages and invest money in them. Joe is having second thoughts about the whole thing, as one of their investors goes all in and even takes a huge mortgage on his belongings. Joe tells Dean that he cannot do this. What if they lost all the money? Then what? The investor will lose everything, and the investor has 4 kids. He has, in a way, handed them over the money for their college. Dean explains to him that they're not a fraud, and they will do whatever it takes to keep the investors in profit. Joe meets Sydney again, and they both get along quite well. Afterward, Joe goes to his home and tells his father that he's going to set him up for good and get him out of this shitty house. His father is not so sure about how fast things were going. Joe goes to the art gallery where Sydney works, and Sydney's boss insults her as one of the pieces of art was damaged. She gets sad and moves to a corner. Meanwhile, Dean comes to Joe and tells him that the gold stocks went 50% down. Joe ignores him and goes to Sydney to cheer her up. They both have a good time together and end up having sex. Joe and Dean go to Ron and tell him that they're going to move the money into the energy sector, as they know that is the future. They hire a bodyguard so that people get curious. They do a huge conference with all the members of an energy company, and Joe is able to convince everyone in the room to go along with BBC. They've landed a huge deal now, and money will be pouring in anytime soon. Joe takes Dean to a beautiful house in the Beverly Hills, and Dean asks him what they were doing there. Joe tells him that they've made it. Joe buys the house and throws a party there. The money Ron was supposed to wire has not yet reached, so Joe is worried. As Ron comes to the party, Joe asks him about the money and tells him that he's in hot water. Ron tells him that he knows that he's been using the investments to pay up for his expenses. The party gets really wild, and everyone has a great time there. Ron even gifts Dean and Ron Rolex watches and tells them that they have humbled him. Charlie and the Biltmore boys are given their shares in the company, which makes the party even wilder. The next day at the office, when Joe calls Frank to check on the payment that Ron was supposed to send them, Frank tells him everything about what Ron has been up to. Ron had double-crossed everyone, as the account he gave the boys to work with was a phony account, and he used that account statement to get a $1.5 million loan from another broker. Ron was a big-time con man. Sydney goes home and finds that Joe is all a mess at the moment. He tells her that he owes a lot of people a lot of money, and Ron had fooled him. They find out that the Rolex Ron gave him was also a fake. Joe finds Ron shopping in an expensive shop, and he confronts him. When Ron sits with all of his other partners and tells them what Ron had done with them, everyone is panicking. Dean suggests getting even with him. They all start talking hypothetically about what they should do with Ron. Joe takes his bodyguard to Ron's house and scares him to take the money. They threaten to shoot his dog, and Ron tells him where the money was. Ron tells Joe that he used him to con Frank and not the other way around. Ron here offers Joe to come and start working with him, and he tells him that they can work together in the big league. They will be able to make more than $3 million in just 1 month. Joe's bodyguard takes off the mask, and Ron starts to make fun of him. This makes him angry, and he shoots Ron. Joe goes to meet Sydney's parents, and he's already 40 minutes late. When he gets there, he starts to act weird. Dean also comes and greets Sydney's parents. Sydney's mom spots blood on Joe's collar, and suddenly Joe gets up and tells them that he has to leave for a client meeting and leaves. Dean rushes after Joe, and Joe tells him what had happened. Dean tells Joe that Ron got what he deserved, and he was not a good person. He gives the check to Dean and then leaves with his bodyguard as Dean distracts everyone else. They take Ron's body to a jungle and throw acid on it. When Joe gets back home, he asks Sydney if she was up, and she does not reply, so he goes back to sleep. Sydney was awake but did not reply because she was angry about what had happened previously. Next, we see that the company is going to be bankrupt, and all the investors are anxious to see their profit returns. Joe and Dean have a conversation about the whole situation. Things were getting worse, and Ron's check also bounced. They then reach Izzy for help. Izzy arranges a meeting with his father, as he wanted to get into the BBC really badly. His father was wanted by the Iranian intelligence, and he was under surveillance by the FBI. The boys were getting into some really dark stuff now. They planned to smuggle Izzy's father out of the state in a box, but he gets angry with their idea. He starts to take opium and faints due to an overdose. They use this opportunity to move him into the box. They bring him to Los Angeles. Joe goes to Sydney right before her show and tells her that she needs to go out of town with him after the show. She tells him that she's not going anywhere with him. All the shareholders of the company gather in the office as they know the company is going to go down now. The Biltmore brothers are the first ones to leave the company. Izzy's father gets up and starts to have a fight with Dean. Joe tries to interfere, but Dean ends up eventually killing Izzy's father. Joe tells Dean that they have to turn themselves in, but Dean sees that dumping the body is the only option that they have. They dump the body, and Joe tells Dean that he's getting the diamonds, paying back the loans, and then he's out of the company for good. Dean goes home and gets into an argument with Sydney as she asks him where Joe was. Sydney asks Dean where Ron was, and Dean gets shocked about how she knows about what happened to Ron. She then tells Dean that he was the reason Joe's life became so miserable. She then slaps him, and he kisses her, and then she kicks him and leaves. Joe goes back to his father's apartment. He goes to his father and tells him that it all got away from him. He takes his father and Izzy to the bank to get the diamonds out of the safety deposit box. As the bank manager takes Izzy away to sign a few documents, Joe talks to his father and tells him that he has no idea how many people he had lied to or hurt. At this moment, the cops come and arrest Joe for the murder of Ron. As Sydney was asking too many questions about Ron, the cops were able to connect the dots. Dean and Joe were both taken under police custody. Then we see Dean, who tells the cops about everything that had happened. He basically blames everything on Joe. The police believe Dean as he convinces them that it was all Joe's plan, and he did everything. The police let Dean go the next day as he testified against Joe. As Dean leaves the police station, Joe is seen dragged by the cops. As he looks at Dean, Joe knows that he is done for it now. Subscribe for more videos like this, turn on the notification, and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.